Few photographs in American history are as disturbing or as revealing as the one taken in the quiet Louisiana countryside on May 23rd, 1934. In that single frozen moment, the violent careers of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow came to a brutal end. The image doesn't glamorize their legend the way Hollywood later would. Instead, it shows the raw, unforgiving reality of what happened when lawmen finally caught up with America's most infamous outlaw couple. Bullets tore through steel, glass, and flesh in a matter of seconds, ending a crime spree that had captured the nation's morbid fascination. This photo isn't just gruesome. It's a stark reminder that the outlaw life rarely ends in romance, but in sudden, irreversible violence. If you enjoy deep dives into the true stories behind America's most notorious outlaws, lawmen, and forgotten moments of history, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and stay tuned. Because the real Old West was far darker than the movies ever showed. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker and Clyde Chestnut Barrow became two of the most infamous figures of the Great Depression, known for a string of robberies and confrontations with authorities across the United States. Their criminal activity, widely covered by newspapers, turned them into national figures during a time when economic hardship fueled public fascination with outlaws. Their story came to an end on May 23rd, 1934, when law enforcement officers in Louisiana carried out a carefully planned ambush. The officers discharged a large number of rounds into the couple's vehicle, ensuring there would be no chance of escape. Photographs taken at the scene later revealed the extent of the authorities' determination to permanently stop the duo's criminal activities. Bonnie and Clyde first met in Texas in 1930 when Bonnie was 19 and Clyde was 21. At the time, Bonnie was legally married to a man who was serving a prison sentence for murder. Soon after their meeting, Clyde was arrested for burglary and automobile theft and sent to prison. Bonnie played a direct role in Clyde's early escape efforts by secretly providing him with a firearm while he was incarcerated. Although he was quickly recaptured, Clyde was later released on parole. From that point forward, the couple began the series of crimes that would make them nationally known. While they are often remembered primarily as bank robbers, historical records show that Bonnie and Clyde more frequently targeted small businesses, privately owned stores, and rural gas stations. Their actions led to the deaths of at least 13 people, including several law enforcement officers, according to most accepted historical estimates. The pair did not operate alone. They were connected to a loose network of associates, and their crimes regularly made front-page news. As their notoriety increased, so did the resolve of local and federal authorities to bring their activities to an end. A determination clearly reflected in the aftermath documented by photographs of their final encounter. Bonnie and Clyde were active during what historians now call the public enemy era, a period in the early 1930s marked by the rise of highly publicized criminal figures. The term was popularized by Frank J. Loesch, chairman of the Chicago Crime Commission, who used it to describe the surge of organized criminals thriving during Prohibition and the Depression. This era included notorious figures such as Al Capone, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, and Ma Barker. To draw public attention to these individuals, Loesch compiled a list ranking the most dangerous offenders. The individual deemed most threatening to public order was designated Public Enemy Number 1, a label that would forever link Bonnie and Clyde to one of the most infamous chapters in American crime history. Bonnie and Clyde's Ford V8 was struck by over 150 bullets following an ambush. On May 23, 1934, the long pursuit of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow reached its conclusion on a remote back road in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. After years of evading capture, the couple was finally intercepted by a coordinated group of law enforcement officers from Texas and Louisiana who had been tracking their movements closely. The officers positioned themselves out of sight along the rural roadway, using the surrounding terrain to conceal their presence. Clyde was driving a stolen 1934 Ford V8 Deluxe when he slowed and stopped near a truck that appeared to be disabled. Historical evidence suggests the situation was deliberately staged to force the vehicle to halt, giving authorities a rare opportunity to end the chase. Once the car stopped, officers released a large volume of gunfire into the vehicle in a matter of seconds. The strategy reflected law enforcement practices of the era, when officers confronting heavily armed fugitives prioritized eliminating any chance of escape. According to contemporary reports, the encounter ended almost immediately. The Ford sedan sustained extensive damage, becoming one of the most recognizable artifacts of the event. Frank Hamer, a former Texas Ranger and the leader of the posse, later emphasized that his goal was to ensure the operation was final and that there would be no further risk to officers or the public. His actions reflected both the urgency of the moment and the intense pressure authorities faced after years of failed attempts to stop the pair. One detail frequently mentioned in eyewitness accounts and photographs is that Bonnie Parker was holding a partially eaten sandwich at the time the ambush occurred. This mundane image has since become one of the most striking aspects of the story, underscoring how abruptly ordinary moments could intersect with historic events during the Public Enemy era. The ambush illustrates the stark contrast between the romanticized image of Bonnie and Clyde and the reality of how their story ended. Law enforcement methods of the early 1930s were shaped by limited resources, public fear, and political pressure to restore order. The events of May 23, 1934, marked not only the end of two notorious figures, but also a turning point in how American authorities responded to high-profile criminals during the Great Depression. Bonnie had more bullet holes in her corpse than Clyde, and there's newsreel footage of the carnage. News of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow's deaths spread with remarkable speed. Within hours, people began arriving at the rural Louisiana location where the incident had occurred. What had been a quiet back road quickly turned into a gathering place for onlookers drawn by curiosity, shock, and the couple's nationwide notoriety. As crowds formed, order became difficult to maintain. Some individuals took items from the scene, including strands of hair and fragments of clothing. While disturbing by modern standards, this behavior reflected the era's intense fascination with infamous figures and the lack of established protocols for securing such sites during the early 1930s. Official examinations attempted to document what had occurred. The coroner reported that Clyde Barrow had been struck 17 times and Bonnie Parker 26 times. Later observers suggested that the true number of impacts may have been higher, as overlapping damage made precise counting difficult. These discrepancies highlight the challenges faced by medical examiners working under public pressure and limited forensic standards of the time. The responsibility of preparing the bodies for burial fell to undertaker C.B. Bailey. According to contemporary accounts, the condition of the bodies made the task unusually demanding. Standard embalming procedures proved difficult to carry out, requiring adjustments beyond what was typical for funeral work during that era. Bailey's experience illustrates the broader reality of how unprepared funeral professionals often were when dealing with high-profile deaths involving extraordinary circumstances. Embalming methods in the 1930s lacked the advanced materials and techniques available today, making preservation far more challenging when bodies had sustained extensive damage. Taken together, these events reveal how Bonnie and Clyde's deaths extended beyond a single moment and became a public spectacle. From the rapid formation of crowds to the difficulties faced by officials and funeral staff, the aftermath reflected both the limitations of the time and the overwhelming public fixation on the couple. Even after death, Bonnie and Clyde continued to command attention, underscoring how deeply their story had embedded itself in American culture during the Great Depression. One of their undertakers had been kidnapped by Bonnie and Clyde the previous year. An undertaker named Dillard Darby was involved in preparing Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow for burial, a role made striking by the unusual circumstances under which he had previously encountered the couple. Darby was not a stranger to Clyde. Their paths had crossed the year before under conditions that reflected the unpredictable nature of life during the Depression-era crime wave. In that earlier encounter, Clyde had temporarily taken Darby against his will and made use of Darby's automobile. Darby attempted to recover the vehicle, placing him in direct contact with the outlaw pair. Incidents like this were not uncommon during the early 1930s, when criminals often relied on civilians' vehicles and resources to stay mobile while evading authorities. During this episode, Bonnie Parker reportedly showed particular interest upon learning that Darby worked as an undertaker. According to later recollections, she remarked, partly in humor, partly in irony, that he should be responsible for the group's funeral arrangements should such a need ever arise. At the time, the comment may have seemed flippant, but it would later take on a far more somber significance. When Darby was released, Bonnie and Clyde gave him a small sum of money, $5, before going their separate ways. Neither party could have imagined that fate would later place Darby in the position of preparing the bodies of the very people who had once detained him. This coincidence has since become one of the more haunting footnotes in the Bonnie and Clyde story. After their deaths, Bonnie and Clyde were given separate funerals, held at different funeral homes, reflecting both family wishes and lingering public tensions surrounding their legacy. Despite these divisions, each service drew thousands of mourners, underscoring the intense public fascination the couple inspired. Newspapers, photographs, and word of mouth had transformed them into national figures, blurring the line between criminal notoriety and celebrity. The massive turnout at both funerals illustrates how deeply Bonnie and Clyde had embedded themselves in the public consciousness during the Great Depression. To many, they symbolized rebellion against a harsh economic system. To others, they were cautionary figures whose story demonstrated the consequences of life on the run. Even in death, they remained inseparable in the American imagination. Two individuals whose lives and legends continued to provoke debate long after they were laid to rest. Inside the Ford sedan, used by Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, authorities later discovered an extensive cache of firearms, along with thousands of rounds of ammunition. The presence of such equipment reflected the pair's expectation of constant pursuit and highlights how seriously they prepared for encounters with law enforcement during the final years of their time on the run. Clyde Barrow's path into crime began well before he became nationally known. In 1926, he was arrested in Dallas after failing to return a rented automobile, a relatively minor offense that nonetheless marked the beginning of repeated clashes with the legal system. Over time, these encounters escalated, shaping Clyde's growing distrust of authorities and reinforcing his decision to live outside the law. As their activities expanded, Bonnie and Clyde began surrounding themselves with associates. One of the most notable was W.D. Jones, who joined the group at just 16 years old. His rapid involvement in serious criminal acts illustrates how young and impressionable individuals were often drawn into outlaw networks during the instability of the Great Depression. Another key figure was Blanche Barrow, Clyde's sister-in-law, who traveled with the group for a time. Blanche's later testimony and written accounts have provided historians with valuable first-hand insight into daily life within the gang, challenging many of the myths that later popular culture would create. The effort to stop Bonnie and Clyde ultimately fell to Frank Hamer, a former Texas Ranger with decades of experience tracking fugitives. Hamer approached the pursuit methodically, studying the couple's habits, routes, and associates. His determination reflected growing pressure on law enforcement to restore public confidence at a time when highly publicized criminals seemed to operate with impunity. Hamer's success marked the end of one of the most famous outlaw sagas of the 1930s. More broadly, it signaled a shift in how American authorities responded to nationally known criminals, relying less on chance encounters and more on coordinated, intelligence-driven operations. The story of Bonnie and Clyde, when viewed through historical records rather than legend, reveals not romantic rebels, but a cautionary example of how small offenses, poor choices, and social instability could spiral into national infamy. In the days following the deaths of Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, enormous crowds gathered outside two funeral homes in Dallas. Many hoped for a brief opportunity to see the remains of the notorious couple, underscoring the extraordinary public fascination they inspired. The scenes reflected how deeply Bonnie and Clyde had captured national attention during the Great Depression. Clyde Barrow's funeral was held privately at sunset on May 25, 1934. He was laid to rest at Western Heights Cemetery in Dallas, beside his brother Marvin. The two brothers share a single granite headstone, bearing their names in a short epitaph chosen by Clyde himself, "Gone but not forgotten." The modest marker contrasts sharply with the outsized legend that later surrounded his life. In an unusual development, the American National Insurance Company of Galveston, Texas, paid out the full life insurance policies for both Barrow and Parker. At the time, insurance contracts did not routinely exclude coverage related to criminal activity. In later decades, however, industry standards changed, and modern policies typically deny benefits when death results from criminal actions by the insured. The law enforcement officers involved in the final operation had been promised a substantial reward, to be divided equally among the 6 members of the posse. Dallas Sheriff Smoot Schmid reportedly assured Deputy Ted Hinton that the total would amount to approximately $26,000, a sum equivalent to well over $600,000 today. In reality, many organizations that had pledged reward money withdrew their offers. As a result, each officer ultimately received just over $200, roughly $4,800 in modern value, along with personal items collected as keepsakes. The discrepancy between the promised rewards and what was actually paid highlights the uncertainty and inconsistency surrounding reward systems during the 1930s. The deaths of Bonnie and Clyde also coincided with major changes in American law enforcement. By the summer of 1934, new federal statutes classified crimes such as bank robbery and kidnapping as federal offenses. At the same time, the FBI increased coordination among local police departments in technological advances, including the widespread use of two-way radios and patrol cars, dramatically improved communication and response times. These developments quickly reshaped the criminal landscape. Within months, several other well-known fugitives from the so-called public enemy era were tracked down, marking the rapid decline of high-profile outlaw activity. The era of loosely coordinated local pursuits was giving way to a more centralized and professional system of law enforcement. Decades later, the story of Bonnie and Clyde continued to provoke public debate and family interest. In 2018, Bonnie Parker's niece and last known surviving relative publicly campaigned to have Parker reburied beside Clyde, arguing that their shared history warranted a shared resting place. The request reignited discussions about legacy, myth, and how history chooses to remember figures whose lives remain deeply controversial. Personal effects. The officers involved never received the reward money that had reportedly been promised. Instead, they were informally permitted to take items from the property recovered from the automobile. Under the terms of his compensation arrangement with the Texas Department of Corrections, Frank Hamer claimed a collection of confiscated firearms and ammunition, along with a box of fishing gear. In July of that year, Clyde Barrow's mother, Kumi Barrow, wrote directly to Hamer requesting the return of the firearms. In her letter, she emphasized that her son had never been tried in court and reminded Hamer of the principle that guilt is determined through legal proceedings. She asked that the items be returned and requested a reply. There is no known record that Hamer ever responded. Another member of the group, Bob Alcorn, removed Clyde Barrow's saxophone from the vehicle. Unlike other items, the instrument was later returned to the Barrow family. Other personal belongings were taken as well, including items of clothing belonging to Bonnie Parker. When Parker's family requested their return, their appeals were denied, and some of the items eventually appeared for sale as memorabilia. The Barrow family later alleged that Sheriff Jordan had kept a suitcase filled with cash recovered from the scene. While no physical evidence has ever surfaced to confirm the existence of such a suitcase, author and historian Jeff Gwynn has noted that Jordan purchased land and a barn in Arcadia not long afterward. Gwynn presents this as circumstantial detail rather than proof, and most historians agree that the claim remains unverified and speculative. Death car. Jordan initially tried to keep the famous automobile, but Ruth Warren of Topeka, Kansas, the car's legal owner, filed a lawsuit to reclaim it. After the legal dispute, Jordan backed down, and in August 1934, Warren was permitted to take possession of the vehicle. At the time, the car remained largely untouched from the events that ended its road career. Despite the extensive damage it had sustained, the Ford was still operational. Warren collected the vehicle in Arcadia, Louisiana, and drove it herself to Shreveport before arranging for it to be transported by truck back to Topeka. She chose not to restore or alter it, preserving its original condition. Over the following decades, the heavily damaged Ford became a widely known traveling exhibit. For roughly 30 years, it was shown at fairs, amusement parks, flea markets, and other public venues. At one point, it was even displayed regularly at a racetrack in Nevada. Visitors were charged a small fee, typically $1, for the opportunity to sit inside the car. In 1988, the vehicle was purchased by a casino near Las Vegas for approximately $250,000, a sum equivalent to about $570,000 in 2024 dollars when adjusted for inflation. As of 2024, the car is displayed behind protective glass at the Primm Valley Resort in Primm, Nevada, just off Interstate 15. It is exhibited alongside the shirt Clyde Barrow was wearing at the time of his death. Barrow's strong interest in automobiles is further illustrated by a letter he reportedly wrote to Henry Ford on April 10, 1934, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the letter, he praised Ford vehicles for their speed, reliability, and durability, stating that he preferred driving Fords whenever possible and expressing admiration for the V8 engine. While the letter has been widely quoted and reproduced, historians continue to debate whether it is fully authentic. The infamous photograph does more than capture a single frozen moment. It marks the end of an era built on desperation, notoriety, and myth. Bonnie and Clyde were not just criminals or folk legends. They were products of the Great Depression, shaped by poverty, opportunity, and a country struggling to survive. History remembers them because their tale sits at the crossroads of crime, celebrity, and American hardship, a cautionary legend preserved in grainy black and white. What do you think this photograph truly represents? Justice served, the collapse of a myth, or a haunting reminder of how fame can distort reality? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the real stories behind America's most infamous figures, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.